Last month, I upgraded to a king-size bed and I built a bed frame for it. And this month, it was time to add this amazing headboard. I've partnered with Craig Tools to build this modern headboard, and you're gonna love it because the back has a slight angle to it and a rod up top to hold headboard cushions. It's gonna transform your bedroom into the perfect place for lounging. Let's get building. The first step of building this headboard is going to be to shape the sides and these back supports. Now I'm building this out of 2x6 Douglas fir. It's construction lumber. It's the same stuff that I built the bed frame out of, and I'll stain it up. It'll match really nicely, but it's going to be very inexpensive, which is great. To make the sides of the headboard look a little bit nicer, I did plane them down. It's not necessary. You can also get a nice smooth finish with a sander. Just make sure to start with a really coarse grit because this kind of lumber usually is pretty coarse to start. The 2x4s that I am using for the back supports, they can be ugly. I don't care. They're completely hidden behind the plywood, but they are going to give you a little more support when you want to lean back up against the headboard. And they're also going to make it easier to hang on the wall with the French cleat that we're going to make later. So I'm going to start by shaping these two pieces, and I'm just following all of the instructions that are in the build plan. Now this is going to be shared on craigtool.com. I'll make sure to put a link in the description below. They'll also have a link to it on my website, housefullofhandmade.com. And to shape these, it's going to be really easy. I'm measuring from the back in a few different marks, creating lines between these marks with just a straight edge, any straight edge you want to use. Once you've got all your measurements marked out, all you have to do is cut along those lines to create the shape for the sides of the headboard. Now the easiest way to do this is going to be using a circular saw and a straight edge. I love using the AccuCut for this kind of work because it's already got a line that I can line right up with this diagonal. I line that line up and I add my circular saw into the AccuCut and cut straight along. Now one of the challenging parts about using the AccuCut on these angled cuts, because it's a short board, is you are going to want to place a extra board on the edge of that AccuCut so that it holds it flat. I also really like to use my AccuCut on top of a 2-inch piece of foam. Now this 2-inch piece of foam just acts as a cutting surface, so I can make sure that the blade is a little bit deeper than the board that I'm cutting, which in this case is 1.5 inches. And then when it cuts through, I don't have to worry about it cutting through my tabletop. Okay, so the side pieces are cut and the back supports are cut. Now the support pieces for the back, they're done. All we needed was the nice angle on it so that we have some support when we lean up against the headboard. For the side pieces though, I'm going to do a little bit more shaping of them to make them really pretty. And to do that, I'm going to first start by just drawing some curves on the edge here and the top. Now this one here on the bottom, I'm just leaving it a nice sharp point. It's going to be flat up against the wall, so it makes it look like the headboard kind of just flows right into the wall. So that one can stay as is. But the other three, I'm going to add a curve to. And I'm just using stuff I have around the shop to give me a curve on these angles since they're not really normal angles. And so for the larger angle, I'm using a little bit larger curve and just drawing that on so I know where to sand off. Then for the smaller, I actually have a piece of scrap 3/4 inch electrical conduit. And this I can use to do a sharper curve up around the top. And with those curves drawn, the next thing I need to do is to mark where I'm going to be drilling my hole. Now, the hole of the top of this headboard is going to have a pipe in it, and I'm using that 3/4 inch electrical conduit, and I'm going to be putting it in between the side pieces above the piece of plywood, and I'm going to be able to hang some cushions on it. It's giving it a little bit of a different look to it. So I have a Forstner bit, and I have a 15/16 is the same size as my 3/4 inch electrical conduit because the 3/4 is the inside dimension. And I'm just going to make some measurements where the center of that hole is going to be. Now it's very important that I'm doing this mirrored so that the hole is on the inside of the headboard, not on the same right or left side. The side pieces are all shaped and they look really, really good. So the last step on these side pieces before we can move on to cutting our plywood is going to be to make some marks where the plywood is going to be attached later on. Because we're working with like some funky angles, the measurements were all based off of, or sorry, all of these design was based off of measurements instead of angles. I'm going to actually use these back support pieces to draw where I want the plywood to go, because the plywood will lean right up against this. So I want to make sure that that is the exact same angle as I'm attaching it to the sides. Now it could be different depending on how wide your 2x4 was, so that's why it's a good idea to do it this way. And I'm just going to measure up from the back. All these measurements are going from the back because I want the back flush up against the wall, and so where it lands on the front is kind of just based off of the angle on your back support piece. So I'm just going to measure up 5 3/4 of an inch, and again, all of this will be in the build plans on craigtool.com. Then if I lay this other board on top of it so that the bottom is at that mark, and then I just line it up so it's flush on the back. That way it's flush up against the back wall and I can draw my line. I also want to mark the bottom of the 2x4 because that's going to be the bottom of the plywood. Next up is cutting the plywood to fit the back of the headboard. And for this king size headboard, it is going to be a 76.5 by 26 inch piece of plywood. And I'm not really great at managing a full sheet of plywood by myself, especially 3/4. It's just too large for me to carry and to manage. So my favorite way to cut this is to lay it out. And I've set up my Craig project stations. Now these are mobile stations that you can use many different ways. And I've set them up here with a sacrificial 2x4 on the top of both of them. And I just cut one 2x4 in half so they're 48 inches wide. They're going to support my entire sheet of plywood, and I can cut right through these sacrificial 2x4s when I'm making this large cut, so I don't have to worry about balancing any pieces that might fall off. To cut the plywood, I'm going to be using this straight edge guide. And this straight edge guide is similar to the AccuCut, but can be used with lots of different things besides just a circular saw. And the reason I'm using this instead of the AccuCut, because I have the extension on this so I can cut up to 96 inches. With my AccuCut, I only can cut up to 48 because I haven't added an extension to it. So I'm going to use this as a straight edge to rip all the way down that entire 96 inches of my sheet of plywood, and then I can cross cut it with either this or the AccuCut, whichever one I like best. The plywood is completely cut out, and the Craig straight edge guide is super great for working with cutting anything or routing anything where you need a nice straight edge. And it lines up beautifully on 2 marks, one on each end, and then you can move the little guides out of the way when you cut so that you don't accidentally cut them. For my cross cuts, I did use the AccuCut again, partially because I didn't have room to use the straight edge guide at the full 96, which is what it was set up for. But the AccuCut also gives such great cross cuts on plywood because that blue the grippy side actually helps prevent chip out. So the two combined made this a super easy process. Next up, I need to finish both of the long edges of the plywood. Short edges will be attached to the side pieces that we've already made. So to finish off the sides of my headboard, I'm using edge banding. And it's just as easy as ironing this on and then trimming off any excess. Now you can use anything you want to cover the exposed plywood edges, or you can even leave them if you don't mind. They're not very visible on the headboard, but I did want to cover mine up. Next, flip over the headboard so on the back you can add pocket hole screws on both short edges. And to add the pocket hole screws, I am going to be using the Kreg 520 Pro. And the 520 Pro is such a great mobile pocket hole jig. I love it. It's got super quick integrated clamp in the handle. And when I'm working on really long boards like I am here, or even when I built the platform bed frame, which I'll link to that video, the 520 is so great because I can just add pocket holes to the large boards right on my work surface and then move the pocket hole jig out of the way, and I am ready to continue on. And there's one more step that needs to be finished before we are ready to assemble the plywood in between the sides, and that is to cut the electrical conduit. This is easy to cut with a simple like a conduit cutter. It's just hand tightens and twists around until it breaks through that conduit piece. Also, if you do not want the conduit to be the natural galvanized metal, this is a great time to paint it because it's going to be a lot easier than painting it when everything's assembled. I've prepped all of my pieces, painted my conduit, and I am ready to assemble my final piece. Now to assemble it, I'm going to be attaching the side pieces that have been shaped to each side of the plywood here. And I've already marked, if you remember from before, where the plywood is going to be so that it matches the same angle on my little back supports. And so I'm just going to use that with the Kreg 90-degree clamp to help hold it on tight with some wood glue and secure it with my 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws, and that'll hold things nice and tight. Now once I get one side assembled, I will have to make sure that the conduit is inside the hole on both sides before I attach the other side so that I make sure that it is fully encompassed inside the headboard. Okay, everything is assembled and it looks pretty good. I'm really happy with how it looks. Now on this conduit there is some indentation and markings and words, but it's really easy to spin that to the back, and it is almost ready to sand and stain before it is ready to be assembled. Or sorry, ready to be hung on the wall. But before we do that, we need to create a way to hang it. And that's where these extra braces come in. These are going to be affixed to the back, and I'm going to evenly space them. That will give straight edge for this to lean up against the wall in case we want to lean back up on it. And to attach these, I'm going to be using the new Kreg Quick Flip, and that will allow me to pre-drill through this hole, or sorry, do a pre-drill into here and then secure this with some Kreg pocket hole screws. Very important to just keep an eye on how far in I'm going and what the length of the screw is so I don't accidentally poke out the front on that. So I'll just attach these. Once I've got the supports, the next step, and this is what will hold the headboard nice and firmly against your wall, is to make a French cleat. And these are really easy to make with a 1x4 board. So what I've done is I've ripped it apart on my table saw so that it is two pieces with a 45-degree angle on it. And this is where it can get a little bit confusing when you attach your French cleat, because what you want to do is make sure that the cleat clamps, like sits onto itself, and that is what's going to hold nice and tight, works for extremely heavy things to hold them on the wall. So we're going to attach the French cleat between the supports with some pocket holes, and we're going to make sure that the piece that is attached to the wall is not flush up against the wall, but it is the widest part of that angle is on the outside and the short part is on the inside. Then when we hang our headboard onto it, we're going to have it also so the shortest part is now facing the back and the widest part is facing away. And it will sit right up onto it, up against the wall like this, and hold it nice and tight. Once the cleats are attached to the wall, all you have to do is slide the headboard flush up against it and it'll hold it nice and tight. Now this headboard can be used with or without the headboard cushions. The bar up top can be just for decoration. But I sewed these simple cushions together, just enclosing a king-size pillow, and I have instructions for that on my website, housefullofhandmade.com. I'll link in the description below. And for more things to build with your Craig jig, visit housefullofhandmade.com and find the build plans for this exact headboard on craigtool.com.